What we need to do is show parents that very important information has been covered up.
I just want to start by asking the CDC one question. How stupid do you think we are? I made a movie about two dumb guys, but nobody's this stupid.
Turn around and face the media, please, and I'll join you and show them and show the world the reason we're here today. These children are trying so hard to show us how to live in a cleaner world. These kids are here for a reason, to teach us to eat better, clean up the air, get rid of toxins, because they can't survive. I know, I really do know that this is their main purpose, and I pray that we all start to wake up and collectively change this world into the new world our kids are working so hard to create.
If we've learned anything from Hurricane Katrina, it's that we can't always rely on government agencies to do the right thing. Oftentimes, they will avoid the obvious cause of a problem if the solution is inconvenient. And I certainly wouldn't trust the drug companies to regulate themselves.
I read these studies, and I saw studies that weren't even good fraud. It wasn't even high-quality fraud. You see the press here and all there, not a single member of this press corps, I can guarantee you, has ever read any of those studies. It has not happened. What they read was the CDC's description of those studies, which has nothing to do with what's in the studies. And ultimately, the American press has completely let down our democracy.
We have, as a nation, gotten used to quick sound bites. We have 24-hour news on 24 stations. So they go to organizations that put together the news stories for them. The NIH on its website, and most government agencies now on their websites have prepackaged stories put together. The industry does the same thing. The pharmaceutical industry puts together stories for the industry to run, so that any of the networks can pick up a story on immunization that's been put together by the people who have a specific opinion. And reporters are simply being lazy. They're not doing their job. They're taking for granted that somebody from the government's being honest with them. And how many times have we seen somebody from the government have an opinion or a position that turned out to be wrong?
"30 years ago, I was involved in a serious investigation of vaccines, and I called various media people, including the New York Times, with evidence that there was a serious vaccine regulation problem in the United States. And the guy from the New York Times said, I've looked into my files, and I don't see any stories saying there's a serious regulatory problem. So as far as I'm concerned, there's no serious regulatory problem." We kept working away, and we had a lot of help from people inside the government, and ended up with hearings by Senator Ribicoff that caused the agency at NIH that regulated vaccines to be closed down, caused the Attorney General to rule that it had been violating the Food and Drug Law for the past 30 years. That was 30 years ago. Caused a situation in which it laid the groundwork for proving that the swine flu vaccine was in fact unsafe, ineffective, and in my opinion, a fraud. All of that was done in spite of the fact that the press systematically said, we don't see any problem in vaccines. The very thing they're saying now.
There was a recent study in 2008 looking at the relationship between children who had gastrointestinal symptoms and autism, and those children who just had gastrointestinal symptoms, to identify whether or not the measles vaccine was related to their development of autism. Now, this was a very small sample size. 25 of the children were in the study group, 13 were in the control group. They made it out to be that this study was definitive evidence that there is no link between vaccines and autism. Now, anyone who knows anything about statistics and studies knows that 38 children is not a sufficient number of children to study to make any definitive conclusions about. And you also have to look at who did the study, and those bits of information don't come out into the public. Unfortunately, what happens is pediatricians and family docs hear the literature and take it as gospel, and then start reporting to parents all over the place that indeed there are no worries about the relationship between the development of autism and the administration of vaccines. But the docs aren't looking at the studies. And unfortunately, what happens in our society is if there's a select group that makes something a truth and enough people hear about it, then a lot of people are going to believe that it's true without actually investigating for themselves.
The argument that these ideas about vaccines are based on science is actually not a sound argument. Most of the research that's done on vaccines is paid for by people who are either manufacturing or selling vaccines. These people are biased in what they do.
All of the safety studies done on vaccines are done by the companies that manufacture the vaccines. The approval of the safety and the approval of the administration of these vaccines is most often done by the employees of the vaccine manufacturers as well. This is a huge conflict of interest. If we want to understand whether these vaccines are safe, we need to have independent researchers looking at these studies and doing them without the financial and the medical interests that are influencing the decision making.
The American Academy of Pediatrics is the union of pediatricians. And one of the things I think you learn about unions is that their job is to advocate for the livelihood of their members. And I think pediatricians are by and large wonderful people. They get into the business of pediatrics because they want to help children and make them healthier. It's a very difficult thing for most pediatricians to come to grips with the idea, even the suggestion, that their care of children may have caused more harm than good.
The CDC and the FDA and even the NIH continue to say there's no evidence of harm because they are only focusing on the epidemiological studies that the CDC funded. They are not looking at the studies out of MIT and out of Columbia, the studies that Dr. Haley has done. They have completely ignored the hard science, which to me is an absurd thing because at the NIH in the 90s, when I was there, you only looked at the hard science. Epidemiology was something that was not given the high priority that is given today in this discussion.
This whole process is designed specifically to make a market for vaccines. And behind it all is Merck Sharp and Dohme as one of the major forces, Merck now, who's gotten hundreds of millions of dollars from the federal government to create vaccine production, distribution, and collect billions of dollars in selling those products. No one who works for a company should be allowed to be on those committees. No one who works for an agency that distributes those vaccines should be allowed to be on those committees. And when the federal agencies are there, they should be counterbalanced by people who are in fact seriously concerned about vaccine safety.
People who are elected to office, who are selected to committees, are often given donations for their campaigns, are often given salaries by the companies that have a vested interest in policies and legislation being passed that mandates vaccines to our children. The public doesn't want to believe this, but we need to, because there is a conflict of interest, because many of the legislators and many of the scientists who are operating supposedly in our best interest are being given money, either in campaigns or in salaries, to support the continuation of the vaccine program.
We had a lot of conversation at the committee level with doctors who were doing research in vaccine injury. Everyone who came before our committee and testified in a public forum lost their NIH funding. Many of them had to, change academic institutions, and their funding dried up. That's an important conversation that really has not taken place in the public yet.
So what you see in the face of good science and rigorous research and courageous people is that the right kind of scientific behavior is punished. And By contrast, the people that are out there feeding the propaganda machine with sloppily designed studies that exonerate mercury, that exonerate vaccines, that exonerate the fact that there's even an epidemic, the people that do that work, I can tell you, that's horrible work. It's poorly designed, it's sloppy. Many of them fall apart on even the flimsiest inspection. Those kinds of people get more grants, they get promotions, they get invited to conferences, they get rewarded for doing the wrong thing.